It had been one of those days, the kind that drags on, like a movie you're stuck watching even though you know you'll regret it. Zhao Yu's office was a cube in a building full of them, one indistinguishable from the next. His computer screen blinked, the cursor mockingly waiting for him to finish whatever menial task had been assigned to him that morning. Zhao was 30, unmarried, and, to be honest, mostly invisible. His co-workers barely acknowledged his presence, and the few that did only spoke to him when absolutely necessary, if a form needed filing, a report needed editing, or a coffee order needed to be placed. He had never asked for more from life. He'd grown used to blending in, to being ignored. But sometimes, when the sky outside the office window looked particularly blue, he would wonder what it would feel like to stand out, to be someone others noticed, someone with purpose, someone unstoppable. It was during one of those blue sky moments that Zhao's gaze wandered across the digital billboards outside his office window. The neon glow of advertisements flickered as he absent-mindedly skimmed over their vibrant messages. One, in particular, caught his attention: "Unlock the animal within." Beneath it was the tagline: "Join the evolution, experience the ultimate in human enhancement." Zhao stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't like him to care about things like this. Genetic modification was still controversial. The government had just started rolling out a program for enhanced humans, mostly athletes, military personnel, or high-level scientists. People who could afford it. People with ambition. Not people like him. Still, something about the idea tugged at him. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the word evolution that resonated, maybe it was the idea that he could somehow tap into something beyond the ordinary. After all, if evolution was all about survival of the fittest, Zhao Yu had certainly missed the boat. He wasn't the fittest. The next day, on a whim that felt utterly out of character, Zhao found himself sitting in a cramped, cold waiting room in the back of an unmarked building downtown. The sign on the door simply read, "Gene Tech." He fidgeted in his seat, glancing at his phone, trying to convince himself that he wasn't making a huge mistake. "What am I doing?" he thought. He wasn't an athlete. He wasn't a geneticist. He wasn't anything. But then again, if this experiment could make him into someone, just for a little while, wasn't that worth the risk? A woman in a lab coat emerged from behind the door, clipboard in hand. "Zhao Yu?" she called, glancing up. He raised his hand tentatively. "Right this way." Zhao followed her into the sterile, white-lit lab. The room smelled of antiseptic and chemicals. A chair waited for him in the center, flanked by a set of strange machines, some that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi film. "We'll start with the basics." "Are you sure about this?" "This procedure isn't reversible," she said, as if reminding him that there was still time to change his mind. Zhao nodded. "I'm sure." His heart raced. The lab technician looked at him with a faint smile. "All right, then. Let's begin." He was strapped into a chair, and the technician prepared the syringe with a mixture of clear fluid. Zhao didn't hesitate, not even when the needle approached his arm. He watched as it entered his skin and felt a brief, sharp pain before a wave of warmth spread through his body. It was subtle at first, like a hum in the background of his senses, but soon the changes began to accelerate. His vision blurred for a moment, and then, with startling clarity, he saw every detail in the room. The pattern on the walls, the molecules in the air, the sweat beads on the technician's brow. His pupils dilated, and he felt an overwhelming surge of awareness, as if his eyes had been adjusted to the sharpest, most precise setting. He could see everything. Next, his body seemed to tingle, like thousands of ants were crawling beneath his skin. His muscles tightened, then relaxed, only to tighten again, each fiber straining in a way he'd never felt before. It was as if his strength had been multiplied 100-fold, like he could lift anything. And then, it happened. A sudden urge to move surged through him, a powerful drive that made him feel like he could sprint faster than any human could possibly manage. His legs twitched. He clenched his fists. He had the power of a cheetah, of a predator on the hunt. The urge to run, to go somewhere, anywhere, was overwhelming. "Relax," the technician said softly, as though reading his thoughts. "It will take a while for your body to adjust. Just breathe." But Zhao couldn't sit still. He was alive, more alive than he'd ever felt. His eagle-sharp vision darted around the room, his cheetah reflexes twitching in his limbs, and the strength of an ant coursing through his veins. It was too much. The first few hours after the procedure were euphoric. Zhao wandered the city streets, testing his abilities. He darted across a busy intersection with cheetah-like speed, barely avoiding traffic. He lifted an entire trash can with a single hand, throwing it across the street as though it weighed nothing. He even climbed a lamppost with ease, like an ant scaling a mountain. But it wasn't long before the exhilaration began to wane. Zhao's mind buzzed with the constant need to act, to do. His eagle vision, which had seemed so powerful at first, now overwhelmed him. Every tiny detail around him was magnified, the sharpness of his senses making him paranoid. He could hear every conversation around him, see the flicker of neon signs across the street, and feel the weight of every object he passed as though they were calling out to him. And then there was the cheetah instinct. Zhao's new speed made him feel restless, as though he couldn't sit still. Every conversation felt like it needed to be sped up. Every movement, every interaction, had to be faster. More efficient. More urgent. But the worst part was the strength. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Every impulse felt too much. His muscles longed to push things, to smash things. At one point, when a woman on the street dropped her purse, Zhao instinctively reached to help her, but his hand clenched so hard that he nearly crushed the purse with his bare hand. He was no longer just a man. He was something more. Something untamed. Later that evening, back in his apartment, Zhao sat at his desk, staring at the reflection in the mirror. He looked the same, sort of, but everything felt different. His body was more powerful, but his mind was unraveling. He could barely think straight. The animal instincts were too strong. He felt the pull of something primal in him, tugging at his thoughts. It was as if the world was too slow, and he needed to act on every impulse that crossed his mind. What have I done? He wondered. But just as quickly, the thought passed, replaced by an overwhelming drive to move forward. To keep going. To do something. Zhao walked over to the window and stared out at the city. In the distance, he could see a hawk perched on a telephone pole. For a moment, he wondered if the hawk could see as clearly as he could. If it knew how powerful it was. And then he smiled, a little wickedly. Maybe, just maybe, Zhao was finally on the verge of becoming someone important. Someone who could actually make a difference in this world. Or maybe, he thought, he was about to lose himself to something darker. Something wild. One thing was for sure, he couldn't go back to being the guy who disappeared in the crowd. Zhao didn't sleep much that night. His mind churned, thoughts colliding like an unruly storm. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled in multiple directions at once, his animal instincts urging him to leap forward, to act, to push harder, while his human mind struggled to regain some semblance of control. He hadn't felt this kind of confusion since he was a teenager, struggling to figure out who he was, but this time the stakes felt higher, more dangerous. By morning, his restlessness had only deepened. He stood in front of his mirror, staring at the person who looked like him but didn't feel like him. His eyes were sharp, unnervingly so. His pulse was quick, his body taut with tension, as though every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to spring at a moment's notice. He had always been a man who blended into the background. Not anymore. He didn't know if he was ready to face the consequences of the change yet, but there was no denying that he was no longer the same person. When he stepped out into the street, it was as if the world had changed around him. Every sound seemed more intense. Every movement was clearer, sharper. He could see the tiniest detail. He could see the individual fibers of fabric in a woman's coat, the microscopic movements of pedestrians as they moved, almost like he could predict what they would do next. He turned his head and, with a slight shift in his vision, focused on a far-off landmark, a clock tower in the distance. He could read the time on its face from several blocks away. It wasn't just that his eyesight had improved. It was more like he had gained the ability to understand everything in his line of sight with crystal clarity. At the same time, the restlessness inside him was unbearable. It was as if his body couldn't stop moving. Every step he took felt like a burst of energy, every moment a chance to run, to rush, to leave everything behind. He jogged lightly down the street, instinctively picking up the pace. A woman with a stroller crossed his path, and before he even realized what was happening, he had stepped forward, instinctively grabbing the stroller to push it out of the way of an oncoming bike messenger. His reflexes were impossibly fast. The speed at which his body acted surprised him even as he did it. The stroller slid harmlessly to the side. The bike messenger swerved, only narrowly missing him, but there was no collision. For a split second, Zhao felt a rush of triumph. He had just saved someone's day. But then the world around him slowed. The adrenaline from the reflexive act started to wear off. He felt the weight of the stroller in his hands, the pressure of lifting it with more force than was necessary. His grip tightened a little too much, and the stroller buckled under his touch. The woman gasped, and Zhao quickly set it down, embarrassed that he turned away quickly, but the animal instincts were rising inside him again. He could feel them, clawing at the back of his mind. His vision was too sharp, his movements too fast. He was hyper-aware of everything, of everyone. People stared at him as he passed, and for a second, Zhao felt like a circus animal, on display for all to see. He didn't want to be noticed. He never had, but now, it seemed like no matter where he went, he couldn't escape the animal inside. He needed to do. He needed to move. He couldn't keep walking through the streets like this. So, without thinking much, he darted to the nearest alleyway, his legs pushing him faster than he intended. The sound of his shoes hitting the pavement was barely audible as he sped up, weaving around obstacles with the agility of a predator. He felt a thrill, like he was untouchable, like he was no longer constrained by the world. At the end of the alley, a large dumpster stood in his way. Zhao didn't stop, he just jumped. His muscles reacted before his mind could catch up. He sailed over it with ease, landing on the other side and rolling to absorb the impact. When he stood up, his heart raced with exhilaration. This was it, the feeling he had been searching for his whole life. The feeling of freedom. Of not being bound by anything. Not by time, not by expectations, not even by gravity, but the rush soon began to fade, replaced by a gnawing feeling deep inside him. Was this really who he wanted to be? He wasn't just the sum of his new powers. He was still a person, still someone who had dreams and fears, who wanted connection, who wanted to be understood, yet, the animal instincts were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. They weren't him, but they were part of him now. How much longer could he keep the human side of him in control? Or was he already losing that battle? Days passed, and Zhao found himself teetering on the edge of madness. His office, his home, the world outside, everything felt both too fast and too slow. His body was a vessel of pure energy, constantly craving action, while his mind struggled to keep it all in check. Every time he tried to focus on something, anything, his heightened senses would pull him in a dozen different directions. His coworkers began to notice. It started with little things, a strange look in his eyes when he was speaking, a habit of tapping his foot incessantly under the desk, the way his words sometimes spilled out too quickly, like he was in a rush to get somewhere he couldn't explain. One afternoon, his boss, a middle-aged man with a perpetual frown, called him into his office. "Zhao," he said, his voice unusually soft. "I've been observing you." Zhao's stomach tightened. He had no idea how to respond. He had been trying so hard to keep a lid on everything, to act normal, but normal had slipped away from him a long time ago. He nodded, unsure of what his boss was getting at. I know you're different, his boss continued, scratching his chin. You've been performing better than anyone else in the office, way better. You're finishing projects faster. You're more accurate. I even heard from Karen that you helped her move some heavy files last week. But there's something off. Something unnatural about it. Zhao swallowed, his heart racing. I don't know what you mean. His boss leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. Look, we're all professionals here. If you're on something, if you've been taking drugs or whatever, just tell me. You don't need to hide it. I just need to know what's going on with you. Zhao blinked, stunned. Drugs? He wasn't on anything. He was just different. The powers inside him were growing stronger, pulling at him, and it was getting harder to deny them. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain what was happening to him when he barely understood it himself? His boss sighed and stood up, pacing the room. Look, Zhao, I don't want to be harsh, but we're a team here. We need to be able to count on you to stay grounded. If you need time off, I'll give you time off. But this kind of performance, this kind of energy, can't be sustainable. You need to figure out what's going on, and fast. Zhao nodded numbly, feeling the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. His boss was right. This wasn't sustainable. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine, when inside, he was barely holding it together. That night, after a restless day at work, Zhao went home and collapsed on his couch. He had no idea what to do next. Part of him wanted to throw himself into his powers, to embrace the animal instincts and let them take control. It would be easy. But something told him that if he did that, he might lose more than just his grip on reality. He might lose himself entirely. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He needed to find balance. He needed to figure out how to live with the animal instincts without letting them rule him completely. And he needed help. But where could he find it? Zhao didn't sleep much again that night. His thoughts were too loud, too frantic. He tossed and turned, his body thrumming with energy that refused to subside, as if every muscle in his frame was vibrating, desperate to act. The sheer force of his new instincts was enough to drive him to the edge, and yet every time he tried to control them, they slipped through his fingers like sand. At work the next day, things only got worse. The walls felt like they were closing in around him. He couldn't focus on anything. His eagle vision, once an asset, had become a curse. Every tiny detail was now a source of agitation. He could see the slight trembling of his coworker's hands as she typed, the erratic flicker of the fluorescent lights above his desk, the movement of the air particles. Everything was magnified, too sharp, too overwhelming. The world was moving too slowly. Zhao tried to concentrate, but the speed inside him kept pushing him forward. His legs itched to run. His muscles flexed involuntarily, like they wanted to break free. He could feel the urge building, like a coiled spring, and just as he was about to explode into motion, his boss called him into his office. Zhao, Mr. Heller said, his voice low, serious. You've been acting strange lately. I don't know what's going on with you, but you need to get it together. Your work is impressive, but your attitude. I'm getting worried. Zhao opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain what was happening to him? How could he tell his boss that he wasn't the same anymore? That he didn't even know what he was anymore? He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. I'm just tired, sir, Zhao said, the lie slipping easily from his lips. I'm trying to work through it. Mr. Heller eyed him with suspicion, but he nodded. You better. I don't want to have to send you home. Take the afternoon off, get some rest. Clear your head. Zhao nodded gratefully, but as soon as he left the office, he couldn't contain himself. The urge to move was overwhelming. He had to run. He had to feel the ground beneath his feet, the wind in his face. He broke into a jog as soon as he hit the street, picking up speed until he was sprinting. The power in his legs surged with each step, and before he knew it, he was darting through the streets, weaving in and out of pedestrians with ease. He ran faster, faster, until the world became a blur. The sound of his breath was all he could hear, the thud of his footsteps like a drumbeat in his chest. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was a cheetah on a hunt, and there was nothing that could slow him down. He felt invincible. And then he realized that he had no idea where he was going. The city streets stretched out before him, unfamiliar and endless. He was in the middle of a neighborhood he didn't recognize. The buildings were smaller, the streets quieter. He slowed to a jog, then to a walk, but the urgency didn't fade. He could feel the animal instincts gnawing at him, urging him to do something, to act. It was like an itch under his skin that couldn't be scratched. He rounded a corner, and that's when he saw it. A stray dog, emaciated and dirty, sitting in the middle of the road, watching him with those sad, human eyes. The dog's ribs were visible beneath its matted fur, its tail limp at its side, something twisted in Zhao's chest. He didn't know why, but the sight of the animal hit him harder than it should have. Maybe it was the fact that he could feel the dog's pain, its hunger, its loneliness, as though he were experiencing it too. He knelt down, instinctively reaching out to the animal, his fingers brushing against its coat. The dog's eyes softened, and for a moment, Zhao felt a connection, a bond that transcended everything he'd been feeling for the past few days. But then, just as quickly, it faded. The cheetah inside him wanted to move on, to keep going, to find something else to conquer. He stood up abruptly, his legs twitching with the need to sprint again. But the dog whined, the sound breaking through the storm in his mind. Zhao paused, his hand still hovering over the dog's fur. And that was when he felt it, his strength, the overwhelming power of the ant coursing through him, urging him to lift the dog up, to carry it somewhere, to do something. But he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to act on the instinct. Not anymore. He closed his eyes, forced himself to breathe. Slowly, he lowered his hand and backed away, fighting the urge to pick up the dog, to do something with it, anything. When he opened his eyes again, the dog was gone, having stumbled away, its tail between its legs. Zhao watched it disappear into the alleyway, feeling both relief and disappointment. He turned and walked back down the street, his pace slowing with each step. His mind was still reeling. The animal side of him was still there, but for the first time since the experiment, he had resisted it. It had been a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. By the time he reached his apartment, the evening was settling in, the sky darkening as the first stars began to appear. Zhao was exhausted, not physically, but mentally. The strain of controlling the animal instincts inside him was becoming unbearable. Inside his apartment, he sank onto the couch, closing his eyes and rubbing his temples. The world felt too loud. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside, the hum of his refrigerator, all of it was magnified, and it was driving him mad. He stood up quickly, the impulse to move again overwhelming him. He needed to do something. But what? He didn't want to break anything, hurt anyone, or lose control. And that's when the idea hit him that he didn't have to do it alone. Zhao had heard whispers about a support group, people who had undergone similar enhancements. People who were learning to control their animal instincts. They met in secret, away from the eyes of society, to share their struggles and find ways to balance their new selves with their humanity. It sounded like exactly what he needed. A place to belong, a way to understand what was happening to him, to make sense of the chaos inside. He found the address online and wrote it down, feeling a small flicker of hope in his chest. Maybe there was a way out of this storm. Maybe there was a way to stop running. The next day, he made his way to the location, a dilapidated building at the edge of the city. He hesitated outside for a moment before pushing open the door. Inside, it was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of incense and old wood. A few people were scattered around the room, talking in hushed voices. One of them, a tall man with dark, intense eyes, looked up when Zhao entered. He had a kind of calm about him that Zhao envied. The man smiled slightly, as though he had been expecting him. "You're one of us, aren't you?" the man said, his voice soft but knowing. Zhao didn't answer immediately. He was still trying to process everything, the experiment, the animal instincts, the growing sense that he was losing himself. But there, in that room, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this. Maybe there were others who understood. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I think I am."